that he has a condo in Trump Tower.
Yeah, he's a consummate Washington insider. He worked with Bob Dole, I believe, and Reagan in some shape, but then he kind of had to go overseas, and he could be an insider and an outsider to work with to work with people like Ukrainian strongmen. Paul Manafort's offer to take on the planning for the RNC in Cleveland that summer was too good to be true. He was a legendary Washington political consultant and lobbyist, a man who enjoyed the fruits of his labor and was curiously volunteering to work for free. Trump liked it, and Manafort was in. So what was some of this ruse here that was playing? Like, how did he get into the campaign? Like, what was the pitch, if you're familiar with that?
I don't exactly know how Manafort got Trump's ear. It might have been through Roger Stone because he'd known him for years, and but I'm not exactly clear on how he pitched himself. Although I remember his letter to Trump asking for a job, the very first bullet point was that he would work for free, and we all know that President Trump is a kind of cheap, and that was a good selling point right there. And of course, he knew a lot about politics. He knew a lot about Washington politics, and that was something that Trump was missing on his campaign. Trump had a very hard time recruiting establishment Republicans to work on his campaign. So, and this was a critical time in their campaign where they had to make sure that delegates fell in line and supported Donald Trump at the convention. And so Manafort was good at whipping votes, and he was probably pretty influential in that period of the campaign.
Yeah, and he definitely knew how to work kind of a room of political people. That just did seem to be quite incredible. So Paul Manafort, he managed to get through 6 months at the pinnacle of the Trump campaign without adding on that his consulting business was tanking, and he was making moves that would lead to inexorably to the federal trial now underway in Virginia. An ordeal that could end with Manafort spending the rest of his life in prison. So, what was really, what's he on trial for? Just like, because for people who haven't been following it, which is to be honest, me, I have not been up on every single day of the the Manafort trial. Like, what is he accused of, and really, how does this relate to Trump?
So he's basically accused of two things. He made a lot of money in Ukraine. He supported this Ukrainian president with pro-Russian ties, this fellow named Yanukovych. He succeeded in getting him elected. And then the Ukrainian people realized that he was more of a pro-Russia guy than a pro-EU guy, who he actually campaigned as a pro-EU guy. So he became very unpopular very quickly. But so anyway, Manafort made a lot of money doing that political consultancy work, and he stashed a lot of that money in overseas accounts. For example, in Cyprus, he'd create these LLCs, these shell companies, where he'd park the money away from the U.S. so he wouldn't be taxed on that money. And then when he wanted to spend some of it, he would purchase things directly through his accounts in Cyprus. So when he went to a very upscale clothing store in New York City and bought all kinds of suits, he'd say, well, charge it to my, I'm going to transfer some money from Cyprus directly into the store's account. So in this way, he kind of hid the fact that this was, he didn't park it in a bank first, and he didn't have to declare it as U.S. currency. He didn't. It was a way he prevented paying taxes.
So he was pretty much doing tax evasion.
Right. So tax evasion is the first thing. So at some point, and I find this kind of remarkable, he got into debt, some serious debt. and he needed to raise cash. He was getting pressured by this Russian oligarch named Oleg Deripaska. He had gotten loans from him, and he had to pay him back, and so he had to raise money. And he went to some banks, some U.S. banks, to get loans, and he inflated his wealth in order to get larger loans. So he lied on bank loan applications about his properties. Like he might have a rental property, and he might have said that he owned it instead, and that way he inflated the value of his assets in order to get bigger loans. So there's that kind of bank fraud and tax evasion were the two things that he was nailed at this trial.
Yeah, and so pretty much what he did is he kind of used Trump and being in the Trump campaign as kind of a place in a position to kind of give himself the ability to make that money and get that loan back.
Yeah, he tried to leverage his proximity to the president with Oleg Deripaska, interestingly enough. He had said in some emails with his right-hand man in Russia, this guy named Konstantin Kalimnik. He was an associate who started out being his translator because Manafort didn't know Russian. So Kalimnik became very important in his consulting business when he was trying to get Yanukovych elected. So he talked to Kalimnik about trying to, quote, get whole with Deripaska by providing him close proximity to the president. He could, sit down with him and discuss policy that would favor Russia, for example. I don't know that this actually developed into anything beyond that email, but Manafort was trying to settle his debt by giving Deripaska and perhaps Putin some greater access into the president or his policies.
Yeah, just to get an idea of what was coming down the pike in a possible Trump presidency.
Yes. By that point, maybe I forget exactly when this email happened. If it happened, after the convention when he was the Republican nominee, or whether it happened in the transition after the election. I can't remember.
And then maybe they'd be more motivated to try and help Trump win.
Yeah, I guess that too. But I think Manafort was mostly concerned about himself at that point. He was in debt to Deripaska, and he was trying to trade some of that debt with his close proximity to the presidency and his ability maybe to influence him.
Yeah, that could be a very good possibility for money making, being that close to a big person like Trump. So apparently, according to prosecutors, he was part of a global fraud scheme. So it is a pretty that kind of a bank fraud scheme. So he was. According to emails and documents submitted as evidence, they apparently showed that the man who had taken on an enormous task of turning around a troubled presidential campaign was at the same time carrying out what prosecutors portray as a global fraud scheme. So it was a pretty big deal, and at the very least, the documents make clear that despite the heavy demands of the campaign, Manafort was also busy maneuvering to salvage his own finances with an eye towards building a new phase of his career. So the fact that he was able to keep that quiet for a period of 6 months was incredible. And so how did Trump and other higher-up people get wind of this, and what was their reaction, do you know?
Well, there was a story that appeared in one of the major newspapers sometime in September, I think, that exposed Manafort to his consultancy with Yanukovych and the pro-Russian ties that he had, And that kind of scared members of the Trump campaign, and so they fired him. And one of the more interesting things about the bank fraud was the dealings he had with this bank out in Chicago. It was a rather small bank, but he wanted a loan from them, and the bank president gave him a loan that was something like a quarter of the entire bank's assets. Huge loan in comparison to the size of the bank, which is very unusual. And then it turned out that Manafort had promised this president of the bank that he could make him Secretary of the Army once Trump became president. So that was supposed to. I hadn't read any news from yesterday, but that was supposed to be divulged at yesterday's day at the trial. They were going to have witnesses come from that bank and discuss that.
Yeah, that seems to be quite a promise for someone who's facing quite long odds to be elected at that time. So he was still trying to get the new phase of his career. He kind of knew he was in danger because of Viktor Yanukovych. He was not able to provide him any money. He was the ex-president of Ukraine. So his expenses quickly outpaced his income. He sent a panicked email to Rick Gates at the time about his tax situation, which included an estimated $500,000 jump in his tax bill. WTF, how could I be blindsided on this? He wrote, "You told me you were on top of this." Manafort's bookkeeper, Heather Washkin, emailed him to warn that $120,000 is urgently needed for your personal bills. He owed money on property taxes, home improvements, insurance policies, and credit cards, and let alone more than $1 million in federal taxes that he still was dodging. So at the same time, he was applying for several bank loans, as we mentioned. He bought, again, $1 million in suits from a Manhattan boutique, and all manner of antiques and home improvements, stuff like that. So it really seems like he was outspent with his means. But how does this compare back to to Trump and the whole collusion case?
There isn't a lot that ties back to the collusion case. The only thing that really ties to Trump is the thing that I just mentioned about this promise for this bank president that he might become Secretary of the Army.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's been no news that Manafort discussed this with Trump or anyone else in the campaign. He might have been just making these crazy promises to the president just so he would get the loan. There's really nothing to do with collusion. I think that the Mueller team had just been hanging these charges over Manafort in the hopes that he would be a cooperating witness in the collusion case, and even up to the very start of the trial, they were hoping he would flip, but he never did. So it's kind of a surprise. It's not. Some people think that maybe Rick Gates, who was Manafort's associate, who did flip, he knows so much of what Manafort already knows that they really didn't need to flip Manafort. So, but it's, and they had all this evidence against him, so they decided to indict him and charge him and take him to trial.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like he can't really hold out forever, right? So anyway, we are going to move on now, and we're going to get to Robert Mueller. The champion in the championship chess match that is the Russia situation. President Trump and the White House are hoping that the Justice Department Special Counsel Robert Mueller has stumbled into what players call time trouble. They could be possibly running out of time. Mueller, they believe, doesn't want to make any major moves or announcements after Labor Day because he's sensitive to criticism that he might be improperly influenced the midterm election in the way that critics on all sides faulted former FBI Director James Comey for handling one of his big investigations in 2016. So, what do you think about this criticism here from Robert Mueller? That's been mostly going to be obviously levied by people like Rudy Giuliani and Republicans who are worried about the situation. What do you think about this? Do you think it's a valid criticism?
Well, No, not really. I mean, Giuliani is saying some things that just aren't true.